welcome to Stephen Nolan, Group CISO from IQUW, and Caroline Paddle from XM Cyber. Thanks to our friends at i360. Great to be here and part of this event again. I'm Caroline Paddle, so I'm the Regional Sales Director for Northern Europe at XM Cyber, and absolutely delighted to be joined by our good friend Stephen today from IQUW. And really what we wanted to do is just kind of share a little bit of the journey that we've been on, you know, and certainly that Stephen's been on, you know, with XM Cyber over recent months. And just kind of make this a nice, open, interactive session. So if we've got questions as well, I'm sure we'll have time for that at the end. For those of you that don't know XM Cyber, you know, there was a really good session from Brian earlier today, if you're in that was talking about the journey that organisations are on and the need for continuous exposure management. And that's absolutely where we sit, and certainly something that, you know, Stephen will be able to elaborate on. But firstly, Stephen, can I ask you to perhaps introduce yourself and you know, share a little bit about IQUW for those that don't know you?
Thank you, Caroline. Stephen Owen, Group CISO for IQUW, approximately 8 months into role now. I specialise in low maturity or accelerating maturity or post-breach, along with transformation. So I'm more of a practitioner, so quite hands-on with my team. And part of this journey started as I go in, I look at, well, of course we do the 100-day plan and look at the board's objectives and look at bottom-up approach, but part of it is the vulnerability management program. And it sort of pivots back to that case study we saw earlier before lunch, where we saw about the incident response, and it chimes into some of these areas. So we went on a journey. I'm always cautious about vendors, and build or buy, I do buy, but I also build a lot as well, because I think that's an accelerator for teams as well, and growing teams and making them more passionate about the subject, and it grows teams as well. So it's striking that balance of when to do it. So what I'm going to touch on today is an application called Yikes we developed. So this is quite fast pace. We've gone on a journey on this. So we did it I did this at eShore some years ago. And last year, the team presented this at AWS. So we did Yikes in the cloud at AWS. This time, I've done Yikes 2, but on premise. And I think that's a lot harder puzzle to solve. And I'll take you on this journey of how we brought in XM Cyber towards the end. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, I think. That was a quote from a CFO I won't forget. So I'll take you on this journey.
Fabulous.
This is about vulnerability management, but it goes a lot deeper. And often I go into organizations and you see, you know, a sea of problems, and it can paralyze an IT business. And I know for a fact, look, I admit I'm a geek, okay? So I know there's about approximately 250,000 vulnerabilities, but as of February, there was about 29,000 which were only exploited. So straight away, it puts context. You just chase initially, you can't fix everything. So this is giving you a level of prioritization of, let's concentrate what could hurt us. That's step one of our Yikes journey. So that's a bit crude approach. So, okay, so that gives me a focus of going after the 12%. Can we get a bit better though? So we tag our assets. So we have one of the scanning vendors, and it works. So at eShore, we have one scanning vendor. This time, we have a different scanning vendor. The same techniques. So we tag our assets from the outside looking in from a breach perspective. So we take from a threat perspective, and we call it crown jewels. It's not the IBM definition of value to the business, but we took it from a cyber threat perspective. So our crown jewel 1, XM Cyber called it Breachpoint. Well, we called it Crown Jewel 1. It might be an exposed public website, FTP server. Then we start tagging the other assets to say, what would they go after? Well, Active Directory, backups. So we started to tag the assets of what we felt we'd care about. So this took us to the next level of saying, well, in actual fact, let's do a simple weighted score model. So take the threat intelligence and what the value of those assets were and add them together, and that comes up, we call it a composite score of severity level. So now we're beginning to focus the business of what to fix and what priority order. And that's the principles of Yikes.
Mm-hmm. Which really complements kind of what we were doing from an XM Cyber perspective. You know, in our own research and analysis, organisations are spending huge amounts of time chasing things that don't materially impact those critical systems, those crown jewels. You don't have endless teams of people and budget and time and resources. So we have to get better and more efficient at focusing in on wherever we've got risk to the systems that matter most to our business and being able to identify and focus our resources accordingly. So we were both approaching it from a very similar,
angles.
yeah. And you know, crown jewels, you know, is a term we use as well, because again, you know, what are those things that matter? You cannot fix everything. So I always kind of liken it, you know, what are the things that you would be getting on the phone to the CEO about in the middle of the night? Because you can't protect everything, but what are the, oh my goodness, if this goes down, it materially impacts our business. And let's start focusing and building our efforts around those.
Yeah, so we've heard about attack service management, knowing your assets. Is think of that as your outer perimeter as crown jewel one or breach entry point, and the other ones are critical assets. So when I talked about threat intelligence, there's some really great open source at the moment. So for the anoraks in the room for threat intelligence, you can easily download for free for all of the CVs. So we download all of the CVs every night. We look at the KEV database, the US database, nuclear, EPSS version 3. Now I'm saying ExploitDB, MetasploitDB. We look at those against the CVE and put a certain score threshold. In actual fact, then add it to the composite score of the asset, and now I'm getting a gauge of accelerated. You know, how fast should we do it? The secret sauce is EPSS. You know, if not many of you have seen it, it's a really hardcore data science security model, data-driven, and it's the accelerant. So think of KEV and ExploitDB to a degree quite static, whereas EPS is very, very dynamic. So if we had a severity 5, you know, 8 is take your time to fix it, 1 is react now within 2 days. So we might have something with some level of threat intelligence at severity 5, but over days with EPSS, the score can climb really, really quickly. So it now focuses the business of service level. We've agreed with the business, service level agreements. And the downside, I would say, of a lot of vendors, and I'm critical of all, and I try and encourage our vendors, is that last mile, because when I report to different operational teams of saying, this is how fast you fix, what have you fixed? Have you breached SLA? There aren't many vendors who help me with that discussion at all, and those metrics. I hate spreadsheets. I want to automate, automate, automate. So that's one of the gaps I've seen from a lot of vendors, you know, and web vendors, others, they'll help me do the detection, but they won't help me to do that management interface. And I don't want an army people reporting every week. I prefer to have real-time dashboards.
Yeah, and that's, again, kind of one of the key areas we look to help organisations is because, you know, in the past, too much management reporting was very metric-driven, you know, number of vulnerabilities, you know, mean time, SLAs, and so on and so forth. But actually, the board are not going to get that excited about that. We need to be talking in business language, business context, objective, and, you know, outcome-based, so that we're actually understanding impact. And so it's translating that into something that the business can understand.
And there is an art for CISOs. I would say a lot of CISOs should be able to talk risk to the board. So the way I talk to CFOs, CIOs, I talk about, I don't almost remove all of the security jargon, and I talk about, well, it's a 1 in 10 year event or 1 in 5 year event, and it's perhaps a 13% probability with an annual loss exposure of, what, £10 million? So if I invest it in X, it will come down by X. Ooh, suddenly that's, a CFO can understand this language. I haven't talked about security. I've said this is what it starts with and this is what it ends with. The secret sauce in part of this, we use FAIR Quant. Again, it's free. I'll do like free things as well. We use the online FAIR calculator and we measure our resistance to attack. So we know our threat capability out there, the bad actors, so we focus on a particular risk scenario. The obvious one is popular is ransomware. So we know their capability from 0 to 100%. APTs might be 100 or aiming towards 100. ScriptKit is at 0 to 20%. So you choose where you think likely your threat capability is. And then we measure our resistance in layers. And the way I articulate it and we measure it is, for example, so you might have a proof point. Let's say majority of attacks come born through email, just for a moment. So you might say, how good is your Mimecast or proof point? How good is your user education? How good is your hardening of a laptop or not? Do you have an EDR or AV? How well is your patching of the laptop? So you can see all of the layers from almost your breach entry point reaching through. How fast can I get off the laptop and actually have you segmentation or not? Do I have a jump server to get to the crown jewel? So I'm measuring that simply, the layers of resistance to get to the overall resistance factor. So part of that story is, so let's say I'm aiming for 65% resistance. What will XM Cyber help me do? Will it improve that to 75%? Then I plug the numbers in 30 seconds later into the FAIR calculator. I put in my annual loss for a ransomware, the reputational cost, the loss, press a button, and it'll give me the figures before and after, and that forms my business case on one slide. So I can now, with this process, start doing the return on investment for all security toolings, even user education. And it's sometimes quite bracing, because I'm a tech first, that some of the best ROIs is user education and backups and recovery. But part of this journey, if I come back to it now, if you look at the slides, that we took the threat intel every day. We look at the asset reachability. So we talked about the breach entry point and the criticality of the assets. And we're adding up all of these numbers against each CVE and whether it's in prod or stage. So there's a different score weighting, and we come up with the overall score. And that determines the severity. It's simple. That's Yikes 2. Works really well. And the adoption, so again, we surfaced it in Grafana, and we looked at the adoption, and we had infrastructure people, platform people, we monitored their usage. They're using it every day, the right times of day. So the adoption and the culture was very good. But then we took it to the next stage, and this is where stage right now XM Cyber comes in, because we're now focusing on that less than 12%, but as an attacker perspective, we know that certain assets, again, should be treated slightly differently. What if a domain admin, we talked about that earlier, I think in the case study, what if those credentials are in memory? I'm doing a ticketing attack. Well, that's not vulnerability management, poor config, or without jump servers, Bastion or PAMs. How do I surface that information? XM Cyber is really, really good on that point. Back to my earlier statement of once you see it, you can't unsee these problems. And it's a very, very good verification. And I'm challenging, there's some really great guys at XM Cyber, a chap called Daniel, and he's challenging me quite rightly and said, when are you going to move away from Yikes modeling to come over to this? Because the beauty of XM Cyber is that it really changes that vulnerability management program altogether. Instead of perhaps now fixing on the 12%, maybe 2%. Because if I fix one or two of those assets, it makes, from a hacker's perspective, to a degree, blind to the other assets. So I'm pinpricking by sniper shooting which assets. So if you've got a legacy estate, or if you want to get very elegant, it's a very, very sharp tool. And it's a journey for a lot of people, and it takes a mindset and close collaboration with IT. It's a journey.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I mean, you know, CTEM, there's already been a lot of talk about it today, you know, that continuous threat and exposure management. And it's just that, it's the next step, the evolution from vulnerability management. You know, we're not talking just CVEs. There's a lot of time and focus spent on CVEs for obvious reasons. But it's the credentials, it's the misconfigurations, it's the lack of network segmentation, it's the real-time behavior, it's all of these things that if an attacker gets a foothold in an environment, they will look to leverage. No attacker ever just comes into an environment, compromises a CV, and it's game over. You know, they might use a couple of them, but actually, why go to that effort if you've got domain admin littered about the place? You know, they will lay off the land, and they will look for the easy things that they can do to laterally move and reach their goal and compromise those crown jewels. So it's about, firstly, having that visibility of the environment. Where have we got all of these risks and exposures? And as Stephen quite rightly says, it's then about understanding where to focus and pinpoint your efforts. Where can we have the biggest bang for our buck with our resources? You know, in our terminology, that's choke points. So, you know, that sniper-based approach. Where can we address multiple exposures with a single remediation? Because we don't have those endless teams of people. So getting really smart about, you know, what we do, how we do it, and better mobilizing that. Move away from the spreadsheets and the endless things to do. That's what's broken. Teams are just drowning in stuff. And we need to give actionable intelligence that you can evidence and see a reduction in risk accordingly.
Yeah, and I think as you do the choke point scenario, they're more likely to trip over your wires, whether you have EDRs, detection to dark trace, they're more likely, and if they're not living off the land, off your assets, or I think they're more likely to trigger this. And if you look at Verizon breach reports over the last few years, I think they're quite good on this, that's saying how many hops do the attackers go for. Typically, it used to be like 7, the worst case. 5, they'll start dropping off. 3, you're trying to get that down to, well, ideally none, okay? But it's where do they start giving up, okay? And it's that breach point. So, yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, and moving risk away from those critical assets, you know, what are the paths towards them? We want to break that chain further away. We don't want to let an attacker get all the way up to the front door of, you know, our most critical business systems. So remove risk away, you know, from those, address those choke points and those attack paths earlier on.
Mm. And some of the problems are, you know, compliance regimes and everything else will say thou shalt patch within 14 days when a manufacturer is difficult, okay? Because what you're doing is, well, if you look at, I think, the top 5, certainly in the US, they were ISO compliant, but they were breached, okay? If you want to go tick box, you would higher the risk. You know, as a practitioner, I think your board would prefer for you to answer the risk question first than be compliant. I know one follows the other, but I think the board would prefer risk first.
I completely agree. You know, we've got a client that's actually a telco, and you know, I don't know how they slept at night. They had 8 million vulnerabilities, 1.75 million criticals. Now, they had to address all criticals in 14 days. They weren't even reaching 30 days. And how they were actually going to drive that number down. So instead, they're using us to help them redefine what is critical, because they're not all equal. So understanding where they should focus their efforts, where there's choke points, so they can address multiple exposures, driving that efficiency. Because where on earth do you start with over 1 million criticals, you know? So you've got to have a risk-based view. It's no longer good enough just to look at the CVE and the severity.
Yeah. And the plus side of XM Cyber, it's not just on CVEs. So for some of you may be aware that there's some problems with NVD. You know, they're looking after the CVEs with also the numbering. There's about 300 to 400 of them, but they've got some problems at the moment. Since about February, so your CVEs may be delayed, or your CVSS scores may be delayed, the CWEs. So all I'd say to you, look at your data. Even with your scanning tools, probe the data, the quality of data. There might be a slowness to getting that CVSS. You'll have a CVE, but you might have a criticality of high, but where is the score? Okay? Just be mindful of it. So there's some problems in the industry at the moment. They're trying to address it and move the arguments to saying move it into the actual commercial sector and open sourcing it. So there's some problems in the sector because it's growing at a phenomenal rate. This year, typically they grow 20 to 30,000 CVs per year. Already, it's growing at a phenomenal rate. So you have to change our different tactics. You can't adopt the old approaches. So XM Cyber is, I find, a good tool to help me on that journey.
Perfect. And it's about ultimately understanding exploitability. We can't fix them all, so which are the exploitable vulnerabilities and exposures, that we have. And, getting that from a true risk-based view, there's a lot of false positives that come out, a lot of the traditional approaches and the scanners that are out there. We're looking at the actual underlying exploitability. And we've got countless examples where people have said, oh, no, I've patched this machine, Qualys told me it's patched, or Tenable has said that I've fixed this. And actually, when we look at it, because we're looking at the underlying conditions that need to exist for an exploitability, we're going, no, you might have patched it. You never rebooted the system, though. That system is still vulnerable. And I think you saw similar
I saw similar
things
one.
as well.
So we took it on before Christmas. It's always a painful time over Christmas. And there was a certain compelling moment. I think it was 6 weeks later, I saw time to value. There's a certain point that some of our other scanning tools didn't detect something on our breach entry point. So they're public facing, and it didn't. Okay? XM Cyber did. And it was like, wow, you have saved my bacon here. And that was a turning point for me and the team of saying, wow, we're seeing real value, besides some of the other scarier moments of what it's uncovering, which is good. It's known unknowns at the moment instead of unknown unknowns. So the time to value for us is very, very good. And we started now to integrate. We're very API driven, and we call APIs to all of our tooling, except for one at the moment. It should be done in Q2. Because that's another point, because you may have EDRs or other different capabilities. You may think it's installed, but it's not. So we have a concept of coverage and control efficacy. You'll probably understand. We have CrowdStrike Falcon. Others have different, technologies, very similar problems. But you think it's installed, but it's not installed. CMDBs won't answer that. They'll think it's installed. So we can call the APIs of all our tooling, even as scanning, that we think it's being scanned by a vulnerability management, but some segments weren't. But now we're tying up with all of the different sensors and APIs, we can start seeing gaps, and that's control coverage. We did it ourselves, but I think XM Cyber said, well, in actual fact, you've got two missing on this one. And we looked at our hymn sheet and says, yes, you're right. But it's very, very good. It gives people a starting point.
Yeah. Because those are where people think they've got coverage, and actually there are gaps, there are exposures that an attacker would leverage. This is about being predictive, preventative, knowing where you need to kind of focus in. But I think beyond that, beyond the findings and where we're showing you exposures and issues and challenges, it's then what do you actually do with the data? And a key focus for us is actually how you then use this intelligence, how, what that people process element looks like, and that mobilization.
It is, and that's the last mile. I know XM Cyber has recently done a Jira release. Mm-hmm. We don't. I found this with other vendors that when I went with DevOps squads, we naturally thought, oh, you want tickets in Jira. We did it. They didn't just take to it. The different squads. We tried Slack. You've just got to find what suits these different teams. We've surfaced it in Grafana and those metrics. That, for us, was really, really powerful, and for those teams. So I can look back in time and what level of number of fixes, and did they pass the SLAs 3 weeks ago to now. The execs want to say, where is the risk? If they trust the metrics and trust the team, what are the metrics? They're metrics and trend-driven, a lot of execs. That's it, but if the team, my customer, is the infrastructure team. They're my prime customer. So we treat them as a customer.
And that's very much, again, going back to CTEM, I'm sure there was a slide earlier, it's about that continual process, identification of the issues, validating, looking at the best ways to mitigate and drive that forward, and then mobilizing those teams. And it should be a continual process. And then obviously being able to evidence that to the business as well and show that reduction in risk and being able to communicate to the board, and evidence that the improvements and remediation that we're doing are having a material impact. We're improving our posture and reducing our risk. And I think you've been able to kind of evidence that to your business as well, haven't you?
Yes, yeah. And that comes back full circle with that resistance and measuring that risk, what it was before and after. So if people want to, I've got a Miro board, public Miro board it's a breadcrumb trail of how we've done quant risk and the resistance layers. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. But it just shows the breadcrumb trail, and it uses the free calculator. And look, it's constantly evolving. But I'm mindful of time. Are there any questions or heckles or?
No, stunned to silence. Well, we are running, there's a demo pod, so I think we're coming up later on this afternoon, or we are, in the main hall as well. So if anybody actually wants to take a look at it and see what, it looks like if you view your environment through the eyes of an attacker and see all of those exposures come to life, then pop by, say hello. But thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Caroline.